January 17, 1940, MacDill Field, Florida. The sun rises over the Gulf Coast, casting long shadows across a runway still wet with morning dew. The air smells of aviation fuel and cut grass. In the distance, the low rumble of radial engines breaks the silence, 9 Wright Cyclones roaring to life in unison. A Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, her aluminum skin gleaming in the early light, trembles as her propellers bite into the humid air. Inside the cockpit, a young man, barely 22 years old, grips the yoke with both hands. His knuckles are white. His instructor, a combat veteran from the last war, sits beside him, chewing on an unlit cigar, watching every movement with the intensity of a hawk. The boy's breath fogs the glass. His heart pounds. He has never flown anything this heavy, this complex, this unforgiving. And yet, in less than 2 years, he will be expected to guide this machine through flak-filled skies over Germany, with 9 other lives depending on his decisions. This is where it begins, not in the fire of combat, but in the grinding repetition of training. In the sweat-soaked cockpits of American airfields, where boys are transformed into the men who will carry the war to the heart of the Third Reich. But no one tells them, not yet, that the training itself will kill more of them than many enemy fighters. No one tells them that the attrition rate in training will rival the losses over Berlin. No one tells them that learning to fly the Fortress is only the beginning, that the real test is learning to die in it and still keep flying. In the autumn of 1939, as Europe plunged into the abyss of total war, the United States Army Air Corps faced a sobering reality. The force that would eventually dominate the skies over Europe did not yet exist. America had fewer than 20,000 military aircraft, most of them obsolete.
The B-17, though already in limited production, was still an experimental concept, a 4-engine heavy bomber designed for strategic bombardment, a doctrine that had never been tested in the crucible of modern war. But more pressing than the scarcity of aircraft was the scarcity of men who could fly them. The Air Corps had fewer than 2,000 trained pilots, and almost none had experience with multi-engine bombers. The infrastructure of air combat training was virtually non-existent. There were no standardized curriculums, no dedicated training bases, no systematic approach to producing the tens of thousands of aircrews that would be required if America entered the war. And so, in 1940, the machine began to build itself. Congress authorized the expansion of the Air Corps. Contracts were signed. Bases were constructed in the deserts of Arizona, the plains of Texas, the swamps of Florida. Young men, drawn by adventure or patriotism, or the simple desire to escape the Depression, began to enlist. They came from farms and factories, from high schools and colleges, from every corner of the Republic. Most had never been in an airplane. Many had never left their home states. But they came, and the Air Corps took them. And in the vast open spaces of the American interior, it began the work of forging them into something unprecedented in the history of warfare, a strategic bombing force capable of projecting power across oceans, across continents, into the very heartland of enemy territory. The training they would undergo was designed to be the most comprehensive, the most rigorous, the most unforgiving in the world. It had to be, because the B-17 was not simply an aircraft, it was a flying arsenal, a mobile fortress, a 10-man crew operating in a hostile environment at 25,000 feet, in temperatures 50 degrees below zero, where a single mistake could kill everyone aboard in an instant.
To master it required not just skill, but coordination, discipline, trust. Each man had to be trained not only in his own specialty, but in how that specialty interlocked with the 9 others. The pilot had to understand the bombardier's work. The navigator had to trust the radio operator. The waist gunners had to move in harmony with the ball turret gunner below them. A B-17 crew was an organism,
and the training was designed to forge that organism under conditions that simulated as closely as possible the chaos and terror of combat. But simulation is never the same as reality, and the young men who stepped off buses at MacDill Field or Randolph Field or Lowry Field had no concept of what awaited them, not in training, and certainly not in the skies over Europe. The process began with selection. Not every volunteer would make it past the initial screening. The Air Corps needed men with specific qualities: physical fitness, mental acuity, emotional stability. Vision had to be perfect. Reflexes had to be sharp. Education mattered. The minimum requirement was 2 years of college, though exceptions were made for those who demonstrated aptitude. Psychological tests were administered to weed out those prone to panic or insubordination. The washout rate was high. Of every 100 men who entered the training pipeline, fewer than 40 would eventually earn their wings. For those who passed the initial screening, the journey began at pre-flight school. Here, in sprawling facilities like Maxwell Field in Alabama or Santa Ana in California, the recruits underwent an intensive 12-week course that transformed them from civilians into military aviators. The curriculum was brutally comprehensive. They studied meteorology, navigation, aerodynamics, aircraft recognition, military law, physical training. They were drilled in Morse code until they could send and receive at 20 words per minute.
They learned to read maps, to plot courses, to calculate fuel consumption and drift. They ran obstacle courses, marched in formation, endured calisthenics that left them gasping in the dust. The instructors were relentless. Weakness was not tolerated. Failure meant immediate dismissal. But the classroom and the drill field were only preparation for what came next: flight training. For pilots, this meant primary training in single-engine aircraft like the Stearman PT-17, a fabric-covered biplane that seemed almost quaint compared to the machines they would eventually fly. Here, at fields scattered across the South and Southwest, the student pilots learned the fundamentals: takeoffs, landings, stalls, spins, basic aerobatics. The Stearman was forgiving, but the instructors were not. Each flight was graded. Each mistake was noted. The washout rate remained high. Many washed out not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked the temperament, the ability to remain calm when the aircraft stalled at 3,000 feet, when the engine coughed and sputtered, when the ground rushed up with terrifying speed. Those who survived primary moved on to basic training in more advanced aircraft like the BT-13 Valiant, known universally as the Vultee vibrator for its tendency to shake violently at low speeds. Here, the training intensified: night flying, instrument flying, formation flying, cross-country navigation. The pressure mounted. The hours accumulated. Many cadets flew 2 or 3 times a day, every day, for weeks on end. Fatigue became a constant companion. Sleep was a luxury. The accidents began to multiply. Aircraft crashed on takeoff, on landing, in mid-air collisions during formation practice. Bodies were recovered from wreckage scattered across cotton fields and mesquite scrub. Telegrams were sent to families. The training continued. For those who survived basic, advanced training awaited.
Twin-engine aircraft now, the AT-10 or the AT-11, machines that required coordination, that demanded the pilot manage 2 engines, feather a propeller, handle an asymmetric power condition. This was the gateway to multi-engine bombers. This was where the boys who dreamed of fighters were separated from those destined for the heavy bombers. And for those selected for bombers, the final step was transition training, learning to fly the B-17 itself. The first time a pilot climbed into the left seat of a flying fortress, the sheer scale of the machine was overwhelming. The B-17 weighed 35,000 pounds empty, nearly twice that when fully loaded with fuel, bombs, and ammunition. It had 4 engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. It had a wingspan of over 100 feet. It required a crew of 10. The cockpit was a maze of switches, levers, gauges, over 200 instruments demanding constant attention. Starting the engines alone was a complex procedure that required coordination between the pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer. One mistake, flooding an engine, overheating a cylinder, mismanaging the turbochargers, could destroy the power plant, or worse, start a fire that would consume the aircraft on the ground.
The instructors who trained B-17 pilots were almost without exception men who had never flown in combat. They were peacetime aviators, many of them veterans of the Army Air Corps from the interwar years, skilled in the technical aspects of flying, but unfamiliar with the realities of aerial warfare. They taught by the manual, by the numbers, checklist discipline, emergency procedures, proper power settings for climb, cruise, descent, how to feather a propeller when an engine failed, how to maintain formation, how to execute a bomb run. The training was methodical, thorough, grounded in aeronautical science. But it could not replicate the chaos of combat. The flak bursts shredding the fuselage, the fighters attacking from 12 o'clock high, the screaming of wounded men, the smoke and blood and terror. What the training could do, however, was build muscle memory. Repetition drilled procedures into the subconscious until they became instinct. A pilot practiced engine outlandings until he could bring the fortress down safely with 2 engines dead. He practiced formation flying until he could hold position in a tight combat box through clouds and turbulence. He practiced high-altitude operations, learning to manage the turbochargers that allowed the B-17 to operate above 20,000 feet, learning to function in the thin, frozen air where hypoxia could creep in unnoticed, where frostbite could claim fingers and minutes. He practiced night flying, learning to trust his instruments when the world outside the cockpit was an impenetrable void. But beyond the technical skills, the training sought to instill something less tangible: confidence. A pilot had to believe, absolutely, that he could handle any emergency, any situation, no matter how dire. Because in combat, hesitation was fatal. A pilot who froze at the controls, even for a second, condemned his entire crew. The training pushed pilots to their limits, and sometimes beyond, to build that unshakable confidence. And if it broke them, if they couldn't handle the pressure, it was better to discover that on a training flight over Texas than over Germany. Yet the pilot was only one piece of the machine. A B-17 crew consisted of 10 men, each with a specialized role, each undergoing his own rigorous training. The co-pilot, often less experienced than the aircraft commander, served as backup and assistant, managing systems, calling out checklists, ready to take control if the pilot was incapacitated. The navigator, stationed in the nose compartment behind a plexiglass dome, was responsible for guiding the aircraft across hundreds of miles of featureless ocean or cloud-obscured terrain, using dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and radio aids. His training was intensely mathematical, calculating wind drift, plotting courses on Mercator charts, using a sextant to shoot star sights. A navigator who made a mistake could send his aircraft hundreds of miles off course, into enemy territory, or over open ocean until the fuel ran out. The bombardier, also in the nose, was trained at specialized schools like Midland, Texas, where he learned to operate the Norden bomb sight, a complex analog computer that calculated the precise moment to release bombs based on altitude, airspeed, wind, and target motion. The Norden was classified top secret, considered one of America's most valuable military technologies. Bombardiers were drilled in its use until they could achieve near pinpoint accuracy from 25,000 feet. They practiced on bombing ranges, dropping 100-pound practice bombs on targets marked in the desert. The training emphasized precision, the doctrine that strategic bombing could destroy specific industrial targets rather than simply raining destruction on cities. Whether this doctrine would hold up under combat conditions remained to be seen. The flight engineer, usually a technical sergeant, was perhaps the most technically proficient member of the crew. He understood the B-17 systems intimately: engines, hydraulics, electrical, fuel management. He monitored the gauges, managed fuel transfer to keep the aircraft balanced, assisted the pilot with power settings. His .50 caliber machine gun position just behind the cockpit. His training was dual-focused. Technical schools taught him every system on the aircraft, while gunnery schools taught him to aim, lead, and fire at moving targets.
The radio operator, stationed in the fuselage behind the bomb bay, was trained in radio communication and Morse code. He maintained contact with the ground and with other aircraft, transmitted position reports, received orders and weather updates. 50 caliber gun in the radio compartment roof. His training emphasized speed and accuracy in communication. A garbled message could result in a formation bombing the wrong target, or a damaged aircraft failing to find a friendly airfield. And then there were the gunners, waist gunners on either side of the fuselage, the ball turret gunner suspended in a plexiglass sphere beneath the aircraft, and the tail gunner isolated in the rear of the fuselage. These men underwent specialized gunnery training at schools like Las Vegas, Nevada, where they fired at towed targets from moving aircraft, where they learned to calculate deflection angles, to track fast-moving fighters, to clear jams and stoppages in sub-zero temperatures while wearing bulky gloves. They learned to work as a team, to coordinate fire, to avoid shooting each other or friendly aircraft. 50 caliber machine gun at altitude, in temperatures that could freeze metal to bare skin, required strength and endurance. But more than technical proficiency, the gunners had to develop something else: the willingness to face death without flinching. Unlike the pilot or navigator who had tasks that occupied their minds, the gunners spent much of each mission scanning the sky, waiting for enemy fighters to appear. When they came fast. Messerschmitt Bf-109s or Focke-Wulf FW-190s diving out of the sun at 300 miles per hour, cannons and machine guns blazing. A gunner had seconds to react, to track the target, to fire, to hit. Hesitation meant death, for himself and for his crewmates.
The training tried to prepare them for this, but no amount of practice firing at towed targets could fully simulate the terror of watching a fighter hurtle toward you, seeing the flashes from its guns, hearing the bullets tearing through aluminum, wondering if the next burst would find you. Crew training was the final phase, and perhaps the most critical. It was one thing to train each specialist individually. It was another to forge 10 individuals into a cohesive unit. This phase took place at operational training units, bases like Dyersburg, Tennessee, or Biggs Field, Texas, where complete crews were assembled and trained together. Here, they flew together for the first time, learning to operate as a single organism. The pilot learned to trust his navigator's headings. The navigator learned to account for the pilot's tendency to drift left or right. The bombardier learned to communicate clearly with the pilot during the bomb run. The gunners learned to watch each other's blind spots. They flew practice missions, cross-country navigational flights, high-altitude bombing runs, simulated combat formations. They practiced emergency procedures, what to do if an engine caught fire, if the oxygen system failed, if they were forced to ditch in the ocean. They learned to bail out, how to use their parachutes, survival skills for landing in hostile territory. They practiced until the procedures became second nature, until each man knew his role and the roles of his crewmates so thoroughly that they could function even when communication was impossible, even when half the crew was wounded, even when the aircraft was falling apart around them. But even this training had limits.
It could not replicate the psychological shock of combat, the moment when training gave way to chaos, when the abstract knowledge of danger became the visceral reality of seeing a friend's body torn apart by cannon fire, of smelling the blood and smoke, of feeling the aircraft shudder under the impact of flak. Many crews arrived in England believing they were fully prepared, only to discover on their first mission that nothing could have truly prepared them. And yet, for all its intensity, the training was seductive in its own way. The young men who underwent it experienced a kind of camaraderie that was almost impossible to describe to those who had not lived through it. They were bound together by shared hardship, shared danger, shared purpose. They lived together, flew together, drank together in off-duty hours at base exchanges or in nearby towns. They formed friendships that felt unbreakable. They believed, with the certainty of youth, that they were invincible, that their crew would be the one that survived, that beat the odds. The training bases themselves became worlds unto themselves, isolated outposts in the vast American landscape, far from the cities and the coasts, places where time seemed to move differently. The days blurred together in a haze of briefings and flights, of maintenance checks and debriefings, of exhaustion so profound that men fell asleep at the dinner table. The nights were filled with the sound of engines echoing across flat terrain, of propellers cutting through darkness, of the occasional distant crash that everyone heard but no one spoke about. Death was a constant presence, a shadow that followed the training, but it was always someone else, another crew, another aircraft, another telegram sent to another family. For the young pilots and crewmen, there was a strange exhilaration in mastering the fortress.
The B-17 was unlike anything they had flown before. Massive, powerful, complex, but also strangely graceful when handled properly. Despite its size, it could be flown with finesse. Pilots spoke of the feeling of breaking through a cloud deck at dawn, the sun suddenly flooding the cockpit, the formation of fortresses around them like a fleet of silver ships sailing through an ocean of sky. There was beauty in it, a kind of poetry in the geometry of formation flying, in the thunder of 36 engines synchronized, in the sight of bombs falling away in perfect sequence, the aircraft lifting as the weight dropped free. But beneath the exhilaration was the knowledge, always present, even if unspoken, that this was preparation for death. Every hour in the air brought them closer to the moment when they would face real enemy fire, real fighters, real flak. The training was designed to give them the skills to survive, but survival was never guaranteed. The statistics were grim, though they were rarely shared with the trainees. Of the crews that deployed to England in 1943 and 1944, a significant percentage would not complete their 25-mission tour. Many would be shot down. Some would be captured. Some would evade and make it back to friendly lines. Some would simply vanish, their aircraft disappearing into the North Sea or the clouds over Germany, never to be seen again. And so the training had a dual purpose, to prepare them for combat, yes, but also to select out those who could not handle the pressure, to break the weak before they endangered their crewmates. The washout rate remained high even in the final phases. Men who had made it through pre-flight, through primary, through basic and advanced training, sometimes cracked during operational training. The pressure of formation flying, the constant vigilance required, the knowledge of what awaited them, it was too much for some.
They were quietly reassigned, sent to other duties, and the training continued without them. Yet the training, for all its sophistication, could not anticipate every challenge the crews would face. 50 caliber machine guns would create a defensive box of fire that no fighter could penetrate. This assumption had never been tested in the sustained, brutal aerial combat that awaited them over Europe. The training taught crews to maintain tight formation, to coordinate their fire, to follow their bomber stream leader into the target. But it could not prepare them for the sheer intensity of the Luftwaffe's response, for the head-on attacks by fighters armed with cannons and rockets, for the flak barrages so dense they turned the sky black, for the psychological toll of watching aircraft in their formation explode or fall away trailing smoke, knowing their friends were dying. Nor could the training fully replicate the physical challenges of flying at 25,000 feet for 8 or 10 hours. The cold was almost beyond description. Temperatures that dropped to 50 or 60 degrees below zero, that penetrated even electrically heated flight suits, that froze moisture in oxygen masks, that made metal instruments impossible to touch with bare skin. Frostbite was common. Men lost fingers and toes. The thin air at altitude meant constant reliance on oxygen masks. A disconnected hose or a faulty regulator could lead to hypoxia, to unconsciousness, to death. The noise was deafening, the roar of 4 engines, the rattle of machine guns, the whistle of wind through bullet holes in the fuselage. Men communicated by intercom, but the intercom often failed, forcing them to shout or use hand signals. The stress was cumulative, building with each mission, until even the most stoic men found themselves shaking uncontrollably before takeoff, or waking from nightmares drenched in sweat. The training tried to simulate these conditions, but simulation was always incomplete.
Altitude chamber training at places like the School of Aviation Medicine exposed crews to low-pressure environments, showed them the symptoms of hypoxia, taught them to recognize when they were in danger. But a controlled chamber environment, with medical personnel standing by, was nothing like being at 25,000 feet over Germany, with oxygen running low and no place to land for 400 miles. Cold weather training exposed them to low temperatures, but not while sitting in a drafty ball turret with enemy fighters attacking. Gunnery training taught them to fire at moving targets, but not while the aircraft was shuddering from flak bursts and the gunner next to them had just been killed. And so, inevitably, the real training happened in combat. The first few missions were the most dangerous, the period when crews learned the hard lessons that no training could teach. They learned to watch for fighters coming out of the sun. They learned to brace themselves before flak bursts, to avoid looking at the explosions that could temporarily blind them. They learned to compartmentalize fear, to function even when every instinct screamed at them to flee. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to continue despite it. Many crews did not survive this final phase of training. Their aircraft went down on their first or second mission, before they had learned enough to protect themselves. But those who survived became veterans, and the knowledge they gained was passed on, informally, to new crews arriving in England. Tips and tricks and superstitions, small pieces of hard-won wisdom that might mean the difference between life and death. For the men who went through this training, there was a paradox at its heart. They were being prepared for war by a nation that was not yet at war, at least not until December 1941.
The training infrastructure that had begun to expand in 1940 and 1941 was a massive bet, a mobilization based on the assumption that America would eventually be drawn into the conflict. When Pearl Harbor finally brought that conflict to American shores, the training machine accelerated dramatically. The base that had been training a few dozen pilots a month now trained hundreds. The curriculum that had taken a year was compressed to 9 months, then 8. Quality control suffered, corners were cut. Men who would have washed out in peacetime were pushed through because they were needed. The accident rate climbed. But even as the quality of individual training declined under the pressure of mass production, the overall system improved. Lessons from combat were fed back into the training pipeline. New tactics were developed and disseminated. Equipment improved. Better oxygen systems, better heated flight suits, better armor protection. The B-17 itself evolved, from the early B-17E and F models to the heavily armed G model, with its chin turret to counter head-on attacks. Crews arriving in England in late 1943 and 1944 were better equipped and better informed than those who had arrived in 1942 and early 1943, even if their individual training time was shorter. And throughout it all, the training bases continued to function as factories of airmen. Tens of thousands of young men cycled through the system, some to become heroes, some to die in training accidents, some to die over Europe, some to be captured and spend years in prison camps, some to survive their tours and come home forever changed. The bases themselves became part of the American wartime landscape, temporary cities of Quonset huts and runways rising out of farmland and desert, humming with activity 24 hours a day, then gradually winding down as the war ended, eventually abandoned, returned to the silence from which they had been carved. For the crews who completed training and deployed to England, the contrast between training and combat was stark. The bases in England, places like Thorpe Abbotts, Kimbleton, Molesworth, were muddy, cold, overcrowded. The missions were longer and more dangerous than anything they had flown in training. The targets were defended by some of the most sophisticated air defenses in the world. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots were skilled and experienced, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, Russia. The flak gunners had perfected their craft over years of war. The weather was often brutal, dense cloud layers that made formation flying treacherous, fog that closed in without warning, icing conditions that could bring down an aircraft. But the crews who arrived also brought with them something the Germans had not anticipated, an abundance of resources that seemed limitless. For every B-17 that was shot down, it seemed, 2 more arrived from the United States.
Replacement crews appeared in a steady stream. Spare parts were available. Food was plentiful. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Luftwaffe pilots flying aircraft with fuel shortages, with inadequate ammunition, with worn-out engines, faced formations of B-17s that seemed to multiply endlessly. German anti-aircraft batteries, running low on shells, watched wave after wave of bombers pass overhead. This abundance extended to the training itself. The Americans could afford to train their crews to a high standard because they had the resources to do so. The aircraft, the fuel, the instructors, the bases. They could afford high washout rates because there were always more volunteers. They could afford to lose aircraft in training accidents because the factories back home were producing new ones faster than they could be destroyed. This industrial capacity, this sheer weight of resources, was something the German military had never fully grasped.
They had assumed that superior skill and tactics could compensate for numerical inferiority. The American training system proved them wrong. By 1944, the skies over Germany were filled with B-17 crews, who were perhaps not as individually skilled as the Luftwaffe aces who opposed them, but who were competent, disciplined, and backed by an industrial machine that could replace losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. But numbers and resources could not erase the fundamental human cost. Every B-17 that went down took with it 10 men, 10 products of the training system, 10 individuals who had families and friends and futures. The telegrams continued to be sent. The casualty lists grew longer. The psychological toll mounted, not just on the crews in combat, but on the trainers and administrators who had sent them there. Instructors at training bases sometimes learned that crews they had trained had been shot down on their first mission. Commanders at operational training units watched as crew after crew deployed, knowing that statistically, a significant percentage would not return. The weight of this knowledge was crushing for some. Others learned to compartmentalize, to focus on the mission, to accept that this was the nature of war. For the crews themselves, the training had given them skills and confidence, but it had also given them something else, a sense of purpose, a belief that what they were doing mattered. The doctrine of strategic bombing held that by destroying Germany's industrial capacity, by targeting the factories and refineries and rail yards, the Allies could cripple the Nazi war machine and shorten the war, saving lives in the long run. Whether this doctrine was entirely accurate, whether the strategic bombing campaign achieved its objectives in the most efficient way possible, remains a subject of historical debate.
But for the men who flew the missions, the belief that they were contributing to a just cause, that their sacrifices meant something, was essential to their ability to continue. And in the end, they did continue. Despite the losses, despite the fear, despite the knowledge that each mission might be their last, the crews of the B-17s climbed back into their aircraft day after day. They flew through flak and fighters and weather that would have grounded civilian aviation. They pressed on to their targets, dropped their bombs, and fought their way home. Some made it, many did not. But the training had prepared them to try, had given them the tools and the courage to face what seemed impossible. The B-17 itself became a symbol of this determination. Crews gave their aircraft names, painted nose art, treated them as living things. There were superstitions, lucky jackets, pre-flight rituals, mascots carried on every mission. The fortress, despite its name, could not protect them from everything, but it could take tremendous damage and still fly. Stories circulated of B-17s returning with 1 or 2 engines shot out, with gaping holes in the fuselage, with half the tail blown away, yet still making it back to England. These stories became part of the mythology of the aircraft, part of what sustained crews through their tours. The training had taught them how to fly the B-17, but combat taught them to trust it, to believe that even when everything seemed lost, the fortress might still bring them home. And sometimes it did. The records are filled with accounts of miraculous survivals,
crews who nursed crippled aircraft across the North Sea on one engine, who crash-landed in fields and walked away, who bailed out over occupied territory and evaded capture to return to England.
For every such story, there were others that ended in tragedy. But the survival stories were the ones that crews clung to, the evidence that luck and skill and the ruggedness of the B-17 could beat the odds. In the final accounting, the training system that prepared B-17 crews was both a triumph and a tragedy. It was a triumph of organization and logistics, a demonstration of America's ability to mobilize resources and personnel on an unprecedented scale. It created, in a remarkably short time, an effective strategic bombing force that played a significant role in the Allied victory. But it was also a tragedy in its human cost. The thousands of men killed in training accidents, the tens of thousands killed or captured in combat, the survivors who returned bearing physical and psychological scars that would last the rest of their lives. The young man who sat in the cockpit at MacDill Field in January 1940, gripping the yoke with white knuckles as he learned to fly the Fortress, could not have imagined all that would follow. He could not have known that within a few years he would be leading a formation through the flak over Berlin, or that his aircraft would be hit and he would have to decide in seconds whether to bail out or try to make it home, or that his decisions would determine whether his crew lived or died. The training gave him tools, but it could not give him certainty. No training could. But perhaps that was the final lesson, the one that could only be learned through experience, that in war there are no guarantees, no sure paths to survival. There is only preparation and courage, and the hope that when the moment comes, you will be ready. The training system did its best to prepare them, and then it sent them into hell, and hoped it had done enough. Epilogue. The runways are silent now.
The training bases that once echoed with the thunder of radial engines stand empty, reclaimed by the desert or the swamp or the farmland from which they were carved. The men who trained there are mostly gone, the last of them fading as the years pass. But the legacy remains, in the histories written, in the museums that preserve their aircraft, in the memories passed down through generations. The B-17 crews who flew from England into the heart of Germany, who faced the flak and the fighters and the cold and the fear, did not do so because they were superhuman. They did it because they were trained, because they believed in their mission, because they trusted their crewmates, and because they had been taught that some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for. The training gave them the skills to fight, but it was something deeper, something in the fabric of the democracy they defended, something in the abundance of a nation that could afford to train them properly and equip them well, that gave them the will to continue when all logic screamed at them to turn back. In the end, that may be the most important thing the training taught them, not how to fly or how to shoot or how to navigate, but how to carry on, how to face the impossible and still try, how to look death in the face and still climb back into the cockpit, how to believe, despite everything, that what they were doing mattered. The price was terrible, but the alternative was worse. And so they flew, these boys from farms and factories, these products of the greatest training machine ever assembled, and they changed the world, one mission at a time, one crew at a time, until the war was over and they could finally come home.